a lot of it is good news. I'm sure you've read in the paper the last several months that the world is falling apart, but really that's not what's happening. So I got a couple pages here that I want to go over with you. I was reading about your mission in your organization. Anyway, so when I ran on a platform of trying to reduce the size of government because, for example, we didn't have a capital budget for a decent capital budget for a few years. And the only way we're going to grow Alaska is if we build it. We've got to build roads, we've got to build bridges, we've got to get to resources. We've got sewer and water projects we have to work on, et cetera. But what was happening is as the oil dropped, the price of oil dropped, and our production wasn't the best, you end up using that money to service operating operating costs. And so you don't have the money to actually build the roads, build the bridges, build the ports, or even repair the ports. So part of our plan was to reduce the operating side of things so we could eventually get to having a capital budget that would actually start to get us to more resources. We're going to talk about a number of things that are happening in the private sector. So we've seen actually positive recovery. We're out of recession now. I just got word that our unemployment rate is in the under 6%. It was about 6.5% last year. It's now the lowest it's been in the last 10 years or history?
Right now, the August seasonally adjusted unemployment rate's the lowest it's been in since Department of Labor was recording that.
So many years. That's a combination of the economy getting better, but it's also the combination, obviously, of some folks leaving and going down south where the economy is really high. But nonetheless, the unemployment rate is shrinking, and it's below 6%. Our GDP in the first quarter grew 3.3%, so the economy is growing too. Personal income grew at about 4.1% in the first quarter of 2019. So the amount of money folks are making is growing. And growth has been widespread in the private sector, including construction, oil, gas, and seafood processing. Oil and gas employment is up about 500 jobs over last year. This is for the first time it's been this high in 5 years. And private investment on the North Slope is up and is projected to be $5.5 billion this year. That's an increase of $1.1 billion from last year. We'll talk a little bit at the end here about how this oil tax initiative might change things. And we've also had a record red salmon catch in Bristol Bay in terms of dollar amounts this year. So we continue to encourage, my mantra is open for business. I know it's used by a lot of governors and a lot of senators, but nonetheless, the issue with Alaska has been we've been focused mainly on oil and gas in Alaska. We are the ultimate petro state, certainly in this country and in many respects, maybe in the world. For example, Saudi Arabia, 70% of their economy is oil. Ours is in the 80s, used to be 90. Abu Dhabi and Dubai, for example, their oil and gas portfolio is 10-15%. They're really into real estate and having businesses locate to those places. And so that's what we want to try and do here in Alaska. And so we've started an initiative, a team called the Alaska Development Team, where we're actually put together a team of folks that are in finance, economics, marketing, and we're getting this team together. We should have it all on board by October, but we've had a few people working for us now. You'd be surprised at how little people outside, investors, know about Alaska. We went to an investors conference. If you heard this before, I apologize, but we went to an investors conference in Texas in March. We attended what they called CERA Week, which is the largest oil and gas conference in the world. That's where you'll be sitting at a table, and there'll be Bahrain sheiks, and there'll be folks from China, there'll be folks from London, Europe, all over the place. This is the oil and gas mover and shakers of the world, and the investors. And so we scheduled a number of meetings with some investment houses in Houston during those meetings, and had conversations with them. And we were surprised that some of the folks didn't realize what was happening in Alaska, but there were some folks that did. And Alaska could either end up being the beneficiary of changing politics, and I'll talk about that's happening down south, or we can be caught up in that whole thing and it could be problematic for us. So if you think about this, 10 years ago, a presidential candidate, let's say like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, might not have been taken seriously because of their stance on socialism, socializing everything. But if you flash forward here 8-10 years, they're mainstream candidates down in the lower 40 for president. And a number of things have happened in some of our traditional oil and gas states down south that are changing, as well as Alberta. You look on the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia are squeezing petroleum producers and are squeezing the ability to move fossil fuels across their state and provincial lines. As a result, they have nowhere to go. So on the East Coast, where you have all this gas, the shale gas, I wouldn't say they're giving it away, but basically they're trying to find a way to monetize that gas because there's so much. Out west, it's oil, right? In Texas and up in North Dakota, and in Alberta, it's tar sands. Alberta was locked in by British Columbia and was unable to market its tar sands for some time. Anyway, so what are they looking at Alaska for? They're looking at Alaska to invest in, because of our conventional oil fields. Texas, those oil fields aren't conventional. That's shale, shale, blasting the shale rock for getting tight oil out of there. But also they're looking at Alaska because of our infrastructure. There's a lot of capacity constraints down in Texas and North Dakota. In North Dakota, they don't have the pipelines, so they ship it by rail. In Texas, the pipelines are full, and they're having a hard time moving the oil. When these investors look at Alaska, what they see is capacity in our pipeline. It's only a quarter full. They look at our infrastructure in the sense that it's able to survive earthquakes. We've had 2 major earthquakes in the past 20-some years. A 7.9, I think, back in 2002, that was out by Glen Allen, and a 7.1 this November 30th. And they looked at that, they saw the infrastructure in the pipeline as well as Valdez held up pretty good, so they're impressed by that. They believe that we still have large pools of conventional oil, and we have tremendous source rock, shale, where that oil came from, that we really have just started to scratch the surface on. They're rebalancing their portfolios all over the world. The Saudis and Middle Eastern countries are looking at diversifying their economy and not keeping it in their own countries, and particularly in oil and gas. They're trying to look all over the world to place investment. The tax situation that changed under Trump here 2 years ago, where corporate taxes were lowered, that's also attracting investors to America. So they're starting to look at Alaska as America and then some, meaning we have American law up here for these investors, and corporate law, corporate taxes, et cetera. It's America, but at the same time, it's like an emerging market. We have a lot of resources. But one of the things that fascinated myself and others is they're really looking at Alaska as a place to transport resources to the world. Because as you look at California, Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, closing off that shipment of those fossil fuels, there's only one sovereign on the west coast left, up north of Mexico, and it's Alaska. So there's a real interest now of building this Alberta to Alaska Railroad, which you've probably heard of. They talked about this for 10 years. Apparently they've actually got investors seriously looking at it to invest $13 to $15 billion, and they're now working with their First Nations folks in Canada to try and put this together. Because what they want to do is they want to go north to Tidewater. They see what's happening down south. There's a new election in New Mexico. New Mexico is a big oil and gas state. It's growing rapidly. The new administration there is not as friendly to oil and gas. Colorado, the same thing happened. They're passing laws and regulations in Colorado with regard to rigs. So they're looking at Alaska not just to invest for the resource, but also for a place to transport. And they want to ship their tar sands north so they can be transported out of Anchorage and to go overseas. So there's tremendous opportunity. We have the second busiest cargo airport in the country in Ted Stevens, and it's growing. It's the 5th busiest in the world in terms of cargo. We were just informed here a couple weeks ago that there's about $500 million plus, $500 million plus, $500 million plus going to go in there to build 2 large, not terminals, basically transshipment warehouses for overseas cargo. That's going to have about 1,000 people working over 2.5 to 3 years building those terminals, those buildings, and then about 1,000 to 1,500 people that will work at that operation. And those are supposed to be pretty good paying jobs. So that's what's happening there. You probably saw in the paper here the other day where President Trump has lifted the roadless rule on the Tongass Forest so that we could potentially get a timber industry going back down in southeast Alaska. That roadless rule that was put in place under the Clinton administration pretty much killed the timber industry, but also limited the possibilities of mining in that forest, as well as tourism. And so with that lift, there is a possibility that the timber industry could come back, and there could be some more mining opportunities down in the Tongass. Let's see what else we have here. We continue in our administration to look at regulations to see if those regulations are necessary for the life, safety, and health of Alaskans, or are some of these regulations just unnecessary, getting in the way of business. So we continue to look at some of those regulations, and we've got about 100 plus regulations that we're looking at potentially repealing that could help with more investment and more business in the state of Alaska. Again, we talked about the North Slope. ANWR was also part of that tax bill. There's some possibilities that the leases will be sold in December. They say that's the last great potential for a large pool of oil along the lines of the Kuparuk. We'll know in December how that works out, if in fact they sell the leases and they're able to start to look at going in there and exploring and potentially developing. You know, you've heard of Oil Search. It's a firm out of New Guinea that is taking over from Armstrong, their finds, their play up in the North Slope, which has billions of barrels of oil potentially. Conoco is marching west and finding new oil as well. We have Hillcorp that has come into the state that is going to be taking over from BP if everything works well. And most people that one has a conversation with regard to Hillcorp says that they will produce more oil. That's they're a niche operator that kind of goes into these older fields, these brownfield operations, and actually boosts the oil production. So there is a lot of activity happening in the state of Alaska. The question isn't do we have resources to sell or market. The question is not do we have the ability to transport goods and services with our airport and our access to the Pacific Ocean. The question going forward is going to be, what will the politics be? Not just in this country, but here in Alaska. Will the politics stay the same in the sense that we still look upon resource development and resource transportation as something that Alaska does well? Or will we start to go the way of some other states down south and in some ways the politics as a whole down south? Will we start to reflect that here in Alaska, where we don't want to develop and we want to close things off, and we basically end up in some respects being a large national park? That's going to be the question, and it's happening faster than most of us thought it would. You know, we've always had an environmental movement in Alaska. If some of you remember, Greenpeace was born as a result of Chitka, the nuclear test out on the Aleutian Islands in the 70s. And so Alaska's always been loved by everybody, even us that live here, the folks that don't. Some of them have never been to Alaska. And they're very concerned about what is going to happen to Alaska. But if we can keep the economy growing, if we can keep marketing our resources and transporting our resources, and just as importantly, if we can get more investment here in the state of Alaska, we're trying to lower our electrical costs and make it affordable for Alaskans to stay, but also to attract business. If we can do that, I think you're going to see more and more demand, which is going to impact your business, the construction trades and building trades. You know, we're holding out hope. We'll know. We keep looking at the economic indicators to see where Alaska is headed. But right now, it seems to be headed in the right direction. The question is, what's going to happen, for example, with this oil tax initiative? How that's going to fare? If it passes, or if it doesn't. If it passes, what will be the impact on investment by the oil industry? We're not sure yet. You know, we're going to be talking to consultants and having conversations with folks to see where that's going to go. That particular initiative, the tax that it would put on the industry, I think is somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 million to $1.8 million, somewhere in between those figures. And that could be significant for the coffers and for the state of Alaska. The question is, will that impact long-term exploration, development, and putting oil into the pipeline? That's going to be the big question. So Alaska's at a crossroads right now. The country's at a crossroads when it comes to energy. Lots of energy. We're in a time, it's fascinating, we're in a time of lots of energy down south, lower 48, tons of it, gas, oil. At the same time, the issue isn't, do we have enough energy? The issue is, do we still have the desire to use that energy as a source to generate electricity? And only time will tell. The next 2 years are going to be very fascinating for this country, this world as a whole, and Alaska. So I could go on and on and on, but I don't want to do that. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you have, and have a conversation. How's your business doing?
Good.
It really depends upon the region you're in. I mean, you know, Anchorage is, we're down. Anchorage starts are down. You know, it's not what we used to do, and by any means. Yeah, Matsu's busy. I'm speaking wrong. Please, someone correct me. Fairbanks is hurting me like mad. Southeast, I haven't heard any super negatives, but I haven't heard any super strong. So and Kenai, it seems to always be moving along. But we're down, I mean, at 500, under 500 starts in Anchorage. We used to do 2,000 routinely, and, you know, we're tremendously underbuilt, you know, now, so.
Anybody here from Matsu?
Yeah, right.
You have to get in line to go to the Sonic. Have you seen that up there?
That's great.
It's the prettiest thing. If you haven't seen a Sonic up at Matsu, it's like, it doesn't matter what time of day or night it is. There's 15 cars, 20 cars, maybe more, nonstop. I don't know what it is about Sonic, but we missed getting on the ground floor on that one, huh?
Yeah.
We had the same thing going on in Sedona. We got franchise pita. It's the same thing. Everybody's in line. It's crazy.
So Governor, I do have a question. So, and it's kind of a comment to lead up to the question. So we've got, you know, a pretty clear direction that your administration is running with regards to being open for business, promoting business for the state of Alaska. As builders, every one of us in this room that's either associated or as a builder, we contribute to that open for business concept. You know, whether we're building the businesses that people are starting, or we're generating new revenues by using the materials and the resources that are developed, whether those are developed here or outside and shipped in. Either way we look at it, right here, the people in this room support the open for business concept, regardless of how we look at things politically. I guess the question that I have for you is, as you know, as builders across the state of Alaska, we want to maintain a favorable atmosphere so that people can get into housing, affordably get into housing. You know, there's things that we are doing, such as trying to be super energy efficient, you know, cut the cost of consumption of those raw energy resources. How do we work together with your administration as a building industry to help promote those better outcomes?
In terms of, I just want to make sure, in terms of policy or in terms of?
Yeah, I think there's some policy. I think there's opportunities for some policy, but I think, you know, even just together with helping to, I would say, prevent some of the concerns of maybe 10 years down the road having no building going on because politically it's not even feasible. You know, I want to make sure that my son, who wants to be a part of my building business, he's got that opportunity, and he's not turned out because somebody in Washington D.C. has got a special interest group that's trying to hold us hostage in Alaska. I'll be honest with you, that's what's on my mind behind that question.
Well, if I understand your question, I'll answer it this way. Folks that don't necessarily want development, resource development, are getting pretty aggressive. They're getting very aggressive, very organized. With the rise of your internet companies and your social media companies, there's amazing amounts of wealth being created through those companies, and some of those outfits are using that wealth to move a political agenda that they believe in. And sometimes that political agenda is a political agenda that doesn't necessarily dovetail with what Alaska has viewed itself as for the past 50 years as a resource state. I can tell you this, that we're fortunate that we're on the air routes for the president when he goes to Asia, because he stopped in Anchorage. We met 4 times. And when you go on Air Force One, you go into his office, he's sitting down there with a bunch of his folks, and what he does is he really does sit down and talk and say, what is it we can do at the federal level to help Alaska? We know you're a resource state, we know that you've had issues, et cetera. But again, in the past 2.5 years, I'm just saying, this president, whether you agree with certain things or not, I in my opinion, he's been very good for the state of Alaska with regard to trying to help us develop our resources. That ATA, that Alberta to Alaska Railroad, for example, is going to need a White House permit to go across international boundaries. I have no doubt that if that president is there, he's going to help us tremendously with that option or possibility. But I would say that there's a lot of activism going on, and it's very aggressive. Meaning, people are putting energy into it, they're putting money into it, and like I said, 10 years ago, if someone like Senator Sanders was running for president on a platform of socialism that, free Medicare, free college, free this, free that, not knowing where it's going to come from, people would not have taken him seriously. But now those folks are serious candidates for president of the United States. And you're seeing some of that in some of the states across this country. And you'll see some of that activity. So, the best answer I can give you is, if you get involved, you have a chance of supporting the agendas that grow your business. If you don't get involved, then you're at the mercy of some of these other forces. And that's what I tell people when it comes to politics. You really are going to get involved one way or the other. You're either going to be a victim of what happens, or you're going to be part of putting some work into making sure that your agenda becomes part of the agenda for a state or for a country. And that's what's going on right now. So,
On that note,
Thank you.
yeah, that's a good question, thanks. We've had one of our legislative goals is statewide building code from a 30,000-foot level. Because we know that there are systems and methodologies available that are actually in place. And that's just one of our goals to do that. We've dealt with the state fire marshal, we've dealt with the HFC. There are lots of conflicting things that can be resolved and made a lot simpler and easier to deal with to make it a more level playing field across. We don't really know how you might stand on that or not. I don't know that you would have a position at this point. We would just like to be open to discuss it and to talk with you about it. Representative Rasmussen had a public hearing on a bill middle part of the first session. So that's one of our goals. We'd like to kind of, discuss it, see where we can go with it. I'm not looking to build a bureaucracy because that's not going to work.
Sure.
It doesn't cut it, but other systems are in place that can make it work across the state. And then we would have a level playing field, because right now we really don't in the residential construction.
I'd be more than happy to have a conversation with some of your folks, and if you want to just call the office, set up a meeting, come on in and sit down and talk.
Super, thank you very much. Other questions, please.
So, I'm just wondering what sort of plans are in act, or what would be done if all this exploration and everything, businesses were moved up here? What are the plans for sustainability to make it, for future generations, that this ball keeps rolling, that everybody doesn't just move up here and say, okay, that wasn't for us, and then they leave us holding the bag, of emptiness and, the economy not moving forward, no matter how you're involved in it.
Yeah, and that's the great question, because this is one of the reasons why we've put this development team together, because we need to get businesses up here that bring jobs up here and people up here that want to stay here and live here. The oil industry has been great for Alaska, and the mining industry is great for Alaska. We're going to see more mining plays come online, but a lot of the industries are becoming very efficient in their ability to pull oil out of the ground and mining as well. So what that means is potentially less people. And so we're trying to get outfits up here. I mean, we're looking at everything from data farms to manufacturing to see how we can support our military complex with secondary businesses. We're looking at potentially a timber industry even in the interior that could chip, potentially make OSB, paper, because of our proximity to Asia. I always get a kick out of the how close we are to Asia. I mean, most folks don't realize this, but we are thousands of miles closer to Asia than any other state. We are actually closer to Australia than California is, if you could get your arms around that one. That's how close we are. So we are, with those emerging markets in China and Southeast Asia and the older markets in Japan, I think there's a real possibility for Alaska to capitalize on second-tier processing and even some types of manufacturing. And that will bring more people here, and more people is what's gonna spur demand for your businesses, for homes and so forth. So we want more oil because it produces wealth for the state and revenue to be able to pay for programs. But we also want to get more of these other businesses up because they bring more bodies that stay here and generate the demand. And once you start to generate more and more demand and more demand, it kind of takes on a life of its own. Dubai, as I mentioned, before World War II, was a pearl diving port. Saw lots of sand, not belittling Dubai, camels, and a pearl diving port. They didn't really have a lot of oil, but it was their policies that turned that into one of the most amazing cities in the world. I mean, it has all kinds of businesses. It's a real estate giant in the world. It's got, it's an international, not just cargo passenger hub. It's just growing by leaps and bounds because of their policies. So if Alaska can put into place policies, and if we can all get behind going out and getting some of this investment, in which right now there's a lot of this investment because of how well the stock market has done and how investments have gone down south and worldwide. I think we can get some of these industries up here that are non-traditional. And that's where you're gonna get families and bodies and people that are gonna demand homes, and cars and roads and restaurants. So that's what we're looking at.
I have a question. So you've been to Dubai, I'm assuming?
No, I have not been to Dubai.
I just want to make sure you're not saying you think Alaska should be like Dubai.
No, well, it's a lot hotter all over.
No, I mean like politically, economically,
No,
socially.
I'm not saying politically. What I'm saying is, the analogy I'm trying to draw is that it was actually a resource-poor country, a resource-poor city-state. And through policies, it's attracted businesses.
So
from all over the
policies
world.
you might like to implement in Alaska? Similar policies?
Just the policies regarding the ability to attract business is what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not talking about any of the policies that impacts the social fabric of.
They're
that
not
particular
connected,
district.
you don't think, maybe?
Excuse me?
They're not connected,
Well,
the two?
to some extent they may be, but for example, when you look at Iceland, a country of about 300,000 people, it doesn't have a lot of resources compared to Alaska. They've been able to attract businesses there, and they're isolated in the middle of the Atlantic. I'm just using countries like Dubai and Iceland.
Iceland's socialist also, but.
No, I understand that. I'm not saying we should become socialist. What I'm saying is, Iceland, for example, has done everything they can to drive down the cost of electricity, which allows them to process bauxite into aluminum, which has created a lot of jobs for their folks. And so, if you're going to have demand for the building sector, you've got to have people come here to want to live and want to demand more homes and building, et cetera. So that's the only analogy I was trying to draw, not the social aspects or the negative aspects that may go along with some of these policies.
Mr. Governor, there's a question.
Governor, I remember part of your platform was, I'm with you as a builder, retired engineer, but we have such great resources here, and we're not using it to the capacity. And if we did, we'd have more jobs created, more housing we would need. And I'm looking right across the end as far as geothermal, tidal energy. I think we need to, because of the cost of everything and the limitations, I think we need to invite companies who are doing that. United Kingdom is doing it. There's areas in the world that Hawaii's doing it on Big Island. Why aren't we looking at that as an
Absolutely.
alternative?
Absolutely. That's not something that I scratched off the list. That's something I would support as well. Absolutely. I think, if I was here, if I was in this office for a few more years, that would be one of the things I think, if I was able to accomplish that, that would be one of the hallmarks of this administration, would be to be able to get a lower cost energy to Alaskans right here. And some of those sources that you just mentioned would be part of it.
But
We have another.
he was trying to ask, so.
Thank you. I have a question. I hear that we focusing to continue the development of the uses of the resources here in the oil industry and the gas and all that stuff, the world is moving and it's changing a lot and being more efficient on those type of energy. And how we are diversifying that at the same time that we work with the oil industry, at the same time we also move forward to the changes the world is doing, like more energy efficiency, like solar and wind and all these things. Because eventually oil is, we see this right now, is many countries that are just huge development in the solar and wind and all these other powers that doesn't require oil. How is Alaska moving towards that direction or diversify? There is also space for these people to
Yeah,
use
that's,
stuff
I think that's part of what the question was here, and that is, Alaska is probably the most energy-rich state in the country, right? We have tidal possibilities, we have geothermal possibilities, biomass in terms of, trees. We have oil, we have gas, we have wind, we have hydro. We have all of these, and it's such a big state, right? We're the size of a subcontinent, that I think what you'll see, and I would support it, is, in Southeast Alaska, you have the ability to have hydro and biomass in Southeast Alaska. Up in the interior, in Seward Peninsula, for example, the Aleutians, you have the very real possibility of geothermal. But I would, my administration would look fondly upon and encourage these types of energy sources. For example, I lived in Kotzebue. We had some of the earliest wind power up in Kotzebue, which has helped reduce the cost of energy. So I would be looking at all of these possibilities. I don't exclude some of the renewable concepts that we're talking about. All I'm saying is right now, the world still demands oil. There's about 2 billion people, they estimate, that still don't have electricity. And really that's a lot of whether it's renewables or gas, hydro, in the end, it's to produce electricity for the world. And so the problem with Alaska has been, we're drowning in energy, we have energy all around us, but we're having a hard time harnessing it at an inexpensive rate for all of Alaskans. And that has to do with the fact that some of us are spread out over the size of a subcontinent and we have a small scale. But we're having these discussions on all of these energy resources and sources of energy for Alaskans. So nothing's being discounted.
Thank you.
You had a question?
It's just basically on the same note, but obviously a lot of the conversations about fossil fuels and things like that, and then tax breaks for corporations that can get the oil out. But on a smaller scale, we see the incentives to go just from a household basis, from off-grid, solar, or whatever. We see our incentives diminishing rapidly. By the end of the year, I think we're down to 24% tax because we were 30% last year, and then from what I understand, the next 5 years they're going to be gone completely. So I don't understand why would we be giving incentives to massive corporations to take oil out, which I understand has to happen, but then take it away from us when we're trying to do something nice. I feel like if we use less oil, then we have more to sell. Yeah.
So some of the tax rebates you're talking about at the federal level, I'm assuming. Because we don't, yeah, okay, because we don't have a tax really. I think here in the state of Alaska. And some of the incentives you're talking about on oil, it's also at the federal level, but we also had tax credits here at one time, and we've really eliminated a lot of those tax credits for the industry. What we're talking about now is pools of oil that they have found, and they have found better technology to actually access some of those pools. I think it's a combination of both. I mean, so when you have states down south like Colorado and New Mexico limiting or squeezing their ability to produce oil and gas, all that's doing is benefiting a place like Texas. Massive amounts of wealth are flowing into Texas because they are still producing oil and gas, but they're also investing in other industries in Texas. And I'm just saying for Alaska, I think we still have a real possibility. The world is still going to want this type of energy that we've produced for the past 50 years. Why not do that, but at the same time don't discount some of the other energy generators, energy possibilities for Alaskans as well. So I think you can do both.
Typically, when you see these massive mining companies, which I've worked for before in Australia and in Papua New Guinea, when you go to their operations, they're being run by renewable energy to mine fossil fuel.
Yeah. I have 3 daughters. One works full time at Red Dog Mine above Kotzebue, lead zinc mine. They have to use diesel where they're at and that's part of the discussion because it's such a big state. You're going to have some areas that can use hydro, some areas that could use wind, Out by Toke, the school and some other buildings are run by biomass, so all the trees they have there. But Alaska's so large, we're gonna have to take a look at that. There's discussions about running a DC line from our gas fields on the slope down to connect with the grid. You know, folks have talked about the Wantana Dam. The interesting discussion about energy is this. If I could probably do a test here and say, how many here would be in favor of hydro? There'll be a number of folks that raise their hand. How many would be against hydro? There'll be a number of folks that raise their hand. How many are here for would support coal? There's probably going to be a diminishing number that would raise their hand. How many would be against coal? So my point is, part of what Alaska's wrestled with for years is agreeing upon energy sources to tie into these grids so that we can lower the cost of energy. But Siemens, I believe it is building a DC line, direct current line from Iowa to Chicago. I think it's in the neighborhood of $1.6 billion. It's an underground line. And Alaska has the possibility with our gas fields on the slope, for example, if hydro is not going to be an alternative for Alaska to produce, especially in the rail belt area, energy to be able to take care of the people that are here now, but also bring up companies as well, other industries.
Another question over here.
Governor, 3 quick questions that might not have quick answers. You pulled back on some of your budget vetoes last year. What's next year look like? Also, the university looks like they're putting the brakes on consolidation. What's going on? And are we going to have another session for the permanent fund?
Well, those are 3 quick questions. University, we have a compact with the university, a step-down process over 3 years that we signed with the president and chair of the regents. So that's in place. So they'll come to us with a budget, and we'll agree to the budget because it's already a discussion that's happened. Remind me the other.
Your budget veto cuts this year, what's next year gonna look like?
We're looking at the budget now. We're taking a look at oil right now at $58 a barrel. You know, and that's the other thing. I'm glad you brought that up. So a year ago, October 10th, oil was at $85 a barrel. People don't remember that. And the projection was it was going to go higher. So at that stage of the game, we were looking at taking the next year or two and doing a slight, smaller step down in the budget. By December 28th, I believe it was at $54 a barrel, and they were predicting it would go lower. So that's why we came in with a budget that had a lot of reductions in it, because we're trying to balance the budget based upon oil, which is, you know, it's a terrific discussion as to how long we can keep going by just having one leg on our stool to support government. But we're looking at the budget. We're scrubbing the budget, and we will have that'll roll out in December, on December 15th. I would imagine that there'll be some reductions, but in a different fashion and delivered in a different way than we did this past year. So there's budget, regents, and what was the other one?
Permanent fund session.
Permanent fund session. Part of the issue there is with the unfortunate passing of Senator Birch. We've been working with the Senate to try and get somebody seated. And we wanted to be able to get somebody in there before we call a special session and not have an individual that had the ability to represent that particular Senate district. This is gonna happen, I think, on November 4th or 5th, we're talking about. So November 2nd. And we're in conversations with the legislature now to see if in fact, if we're going to have a special session this fall, or if we're just going to have to place it in the beginning of the regular session to try and solve this issue.
Okay. Thank you.
Chuck?
You know, you say we got a 6% unemployment rate, but in the construction industry, at least for Anchorage and Matsu, it's got to be like 1%. They're to hire somebody, especially this past summer, was next to impossible. And you know, a lot of the skilled carpenters have left the state of Alaska, and the education system has completely failed the trades industry. You know, when you and I grew up, you know, I took wood shop in 8th grade. That's totally gone nowadays. And so, you know, hiring young people, you have to train them. They have no skills and knowledge. And reforming our education system and putting the trades back into the education system, I think would be a great benefit to the state.
I agree, and that's why you see places like King Career Center and the tech school in Matsu, an incredible demand on the part of parents and students to send their kids there for that reason. I just had my kitchen remodeled, and I wish I was a plumber. That was my second job. But no, you make a good point, and Like I said, I have a daughter that works up at Red Dog Mine full-time. She doesn't have a college degree, but she makes very good money as, in her case, as a buyer. I do agree that we need to seriously look at our educational system to see what are the outcomes and what are the jobs for the future. There's gonna be a lot of automation, for example, that will reduce some jobs, but at the same time, you're not gonna replace carpenters, you're not gonna replace plumbers. There's gonna be a lot of those quote traditional jobs that are in high demand because the group is aging out. I agree with that.
Anybody else have anything else? There's a question in the back.
Yeah, good afternoon, Governor. I was wondering if you could set up an appointment with your regional DOT for this area and the city administration of Homer to take care of the issue of Baycrest subdivision and the storm drain issue off of Baycrest.
There's an issue with the road and the storm drain?
Yes, sir, and there's been trying to communications over the last three years, and there hasn't been any real good connection. And it was when they widened the road 20 some odd years ago, they rearranged some of the drainage, and now it's coming on the backside of the subdivision, which has been sloughing off in the bluff. So we'd like to have that taken care of.
Okay, I have one of my guys here taking notes, so we'll get that back to Commissioner McKinnon.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Any other questions we might have at this point? If not, then Governor, we have all the time we want. It's your schedule.
Well, I just came down to thank you for what you do, encourage you to keep doing what you're doing. I wanted to just share with you that I think there's some real positive news for Alaska. There's also potentially some interesting things that can happen in the future of this country in Alaska in terms of politics. We're not running out of oil in this country, we're finding more and more. We're not running out of gas, we're finding more and more. But as you've seen with this discussion today, there's a feeling, a growing number of folks that are concerned about using those fuels and selling those fuels. We don't even talk about coal anymore, right? I mean, pretty much coal is it's a energy source that I think you'll see less and less of rapidly over time. Certainly, as the technologies improve on things like wind and hydro, and there's even in-river hydro, and there's different tidal types of hydro. As that cost comes down, I think you'll see more of it, and it will unleash energy resources in places that traditional energy could not have gotten to before. But I think Alaska still has a role in gas and oil, and certainly in mining. A lot of these new technologies are going to need some of those minerals and some of those rare earths to actually do what they need to do in terms of battery and storage of power. So, and I think Alaska's location is going to really, this is going to be a big component in Alaska's future, our place on the globe. As Billy Mitchell once said, who was the father of the Air Force, he was a general in the Army in the 1930s, when he turned over the globe, he said, those that control Alaska, control the world, the Northern Hemisphere. So we're starting to see that with Ted Stevens Airport and all the activity that's going on there. So I'm bullish on Alaska. I'm not anticipating 2 million more barrels of oil like we had in the 90s or 80s, late 80s and early 90s. But I think more mature industries and business that'll bring people here that'll spur demand for the businesses that you're in building homes and construction. So I wish you nothing but the best. Thanks for having me.
Governor, I have one last question too. Nobody asked about the gas line. Is that a dead issue, or are we walking forward with that?
That's, as we know, it's a $40-some billion project. The world is awash in gas right now. They're in some places they're selling gas for less than $1 a unit on the East Coast, and so it's a difficult endeavor to be able to get investors right now. There are investors that want to step forward. I'm absolutely certain that we would entertain that. As a matter of fact, and I don't like to travel, but we've been asked to go to Japan. This is the 50th anniversary of the LNG export terminal up there in Nikiski, and the Japanese are having a big celebration about this because this helped them with LNG. I believe that you'll see our stranded gas marketed. I'm not sure when, but if it's not through a pipeline, very well it can be just lifted right off the slope and transported if things keep warming up, like we've seen the last several years. So the gas is there, there'll eventually be a demand. And like I said, there also is a possibility that Alaska itself could convert that gas into electricity through DC line. You know, if there was a way to drive the price of electricity down to 4 cents a kilowatt hour or 5 cents a kilowatt hour, you could have a lot of these secondary industries want to come and place their some of their businesses here because of the price of energy and our location. So it's we'll see what happens.
I think there's one more question over there.
Yes.
I want to thank you. You're doing what I voted for you for. We're in tough times, and you're doing some tough decisions, but along that way, some things get pushed away. And I'm not, but for commerce, if you can push some dollars around to get plowing on the Seward Highway during the nighttime, because a lot of our commerce industry, or the stuff coming for our industries is trucked down that highway at night, and it can get pretty ugly out there.
Our children too.
So if we can do anything there, we appreciate it. But thank you for what you're doing in very tough times, and you know, it's hurt me a little bit, but we have been in a bloated fiscal economy, and I'm glad it's getting trimmed back. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll make note of the road maintenance on the Seward Highway.
Super.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.